Chapter 121. On the morning of August 20th, 1887, President Theodore Clay sat in the Oval Office, staring at a stack of newspapers that detailed Japan's swift and decisive victories over China. The headlines were grim. Japanese forces dominate with advanced weaponry, China retreats amidst devastation, and the balance of power shifts in East Asia. Clay's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. His chief of staff, William Gardner, entered with a grave expression. "Mr. President," Gardner began, "the Chinese ambassador has requested an urgent meeting. He's already in the reception room." Clay set the papers aside and nodded. "Let him in." Moments later, Ambassador Li Ming entered the Oval Office. "Mr. President," Li began, bowing respectfully, "I thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Clay extended a hand toward a chair. "Please, have a seat, Ambassador. What brings you here so urgently?" Li sat down, his expression darkening as he placed a leather-bound portfolio on the president's desk. "The situation in my homeland has become untenable. The Japanese forces, bolstered by the advanced weapons and vehicles they have obtained, have decimated our troops along the Liaodong Peninsula. Entire divisions have been wiped out. Our cities are now under siege. Mr. President, China stands on the brink of collapse." Clay leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "I'm aware of the conflict, Ambassador, but what exactly are you asking of the Republic?" Li opened the portfolio, revealing detailed maps and reports of recent battles, photographs of destroyed Chinese artillery positions, burning villages, and wounded soldiers painted a grim picture. "We have reason to believe that these weapons and vehicles were manufactured by Hesh Industries, a company based in your nation," Li said, his voice tight. "Their firepower is unmatched. Our traditional strategies and defenses are useless against such advanced technology." The president's jaw tightened. "Ambassador, I understand your concerns, but the Republic has maintained strict neutrality in this conflict. We do not take sides in foreign wars. Explore more at Novelbin." Tom Lee's composure cracked slightly, his voice rising in desperation. "Neutrality? Mr. President, this neutrality you speak of is an illusion. By allowing Hesh Industries to sell these weapons to Japan, your nation has already taken a side. You may not have declared war, but your technology has empowered our enemies, and now we are asking for the same opportunity to level the playing field." Clay folded his hands on the desk, his expression neutral. "You're suggesting that the Republic authorized the sale of weapons to China?" "Yes," Li said, leaning forward. "Our government is prepared to offer substantial compensation, millions of florins paid directly to your treasury in exchange for access to Hesh Industries' vehicles and weaponry. With these tools, we can push back against the Japanese and restore balance to East Asia." Clay raised an eyebrow. "Millions of florins is a considerable sum, Ambassador, but I have already made a decision." "Decision? Why can't you just offer us the same of what you offered to Japan? Is it because Japan had something on you?" The ambassador's words struck a nerve in President Theodore Clay. His fingers, resting on the edge of his desk, curled slightly as he fought to maintain his composure. The accusation, though delivered in desperation, was dangerously close to the truth. He couldn't afford to let it show. Clay straightened in his chair. "Ambassador Li, let me make one thing perfectly clear. The decisions of this administration are based on what is in the best interest of the Republic, not on baseless insinuations." Li Ming's face flushed with a mixture of shame and frustration. "I apologize, Mr. President. My words were uncalled for, but I hope you understand the gravity of our situation. China is being torn apart, and every day we are losing ground. I came here to appeal to your sense of justice." A day earlier, meanwhile, at Hesh Industries headquarters in Sylvania, Matthew was having a meeting with Charles in one of the local restaurants. "Mr. Fitzwilliam, thank you for accepting my sudden invitation of a meeting," Matthew said. "Why are you so being formal, Matthew?" Charles replied with a chuckle. "I am on your good side now that you have began selling weapons to Japan. Yeah, it's a must because the president ordered it, which is also the reason as to why we are having a discussion in the first place," Matthew said, beginning their meeting. "Is there any reason as to why the president wanted me to sell the weapons only to Japan and not to other countries?" "I don't know, Matthew. The president's decision could be rooted in strategy. Perhaps the administration sees Japan as the better bet for stability in East Asia." Matthew tapped his fingers against the edge of the table, his skepticism evident. "Better bet? That seems overly simplistic for a conflict as complex as this one. Japan and China are both significant powers. Why throw all our chips in with one side?" Charles shrugged. "Politics is rarely straightforward. There could be alliances or unseen diplomatic strings being pulled." Matthew leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What if it's more than politics? Something specific like leverage? You know how these things work. Sometimes nations find creative ways to tip the scales. Charles raised an eyebrow. Leverage? Are you suggesting the Japanese might have something on the president? That's a serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone, Matthew replied evenly. I'm just trying to make sense of why the administration is so adamant about favoring Japan, especially when China is offering to pay millions of florins for the same technology. Charles took a sip of his wine, studying Matthew over the rim of his glass. You think there's something the Japanese could use to pressure the president? Matthew nodded slowly. It's not unheard of. A scandal, maybe something damaging enough to force his hand. Charles frowned, the idea clearly unsettling him. If that's true, it would explain a lot. But what kind of scandal could be big enough to make a sitting president risk international scrutiny by taking sides so blatantly? Matthew leaned back, his expression contemplative. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Scandals come in many forms: financial, personal, political. But whatever it is, it must be damning enough that the president sees no alternative. Charles sighed, setting down his glass. Even if you're right, Matthew, what can you do about it? You're not exactly in a position to challenge the administration. I'm not looking to challenge anyone, Matthew said firmly. I just want to understand the full picture. Decisions like these have consequences, not just for the Republic but for my company. If we're being dragged into something bigger than we realize, I need to know. Charles nodded slowly, his usual confidence tempered by a rare moment of introspection. Well, I can't help you much on this front. Politics isn't my game, and I don't have the ear of the president the way you might think. Matthew chuckled dryly. You've got connections everywhere. Charles, don't play coy. Connections, yes, Charles admitted. But nothing that would give me insight into something as sensitive as blackmail. Matthew let the conversation hang for a moment before changing the subject. Tell me this: if you were in the president's shoes, what would you do if you were being pressured? Charles smirked, his confidence returning. If I were being pressured, I'd turn the tables, find leverage of my own. But that's the businessman in me. Politics is a different beast. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. Leverage, huh? Sometimes I wonder if that's all this world runs on. Don't wonder, Charles said with a grin. It does. Chapter 122. Matthew Hesh returned to his office after a tense meeting with Charles Fitzwilliam. Charles' nonchalant attitude toward the president's motivations had only heightened Matthew's suspicions. Something wasn't right. The conversation lingered in his mind, particularly Charles' remark about leverage. If the Japanese have something on the president, what could it be? Matthew thought, sitting at his desk and staring at a blank sheet of paper. Robert Anders entered the room quietly, placing a stack of freshly compiled reports on the desk. Back so soon? Robert asked. Noticing Matthew's pensive expression, too soon, Matthew replied, leaning back in his chair. Something about this Japan-China situation doesn't add up, Robert, and I think President Clay is hiding something the Japanese know about. Find adventures at Novelbin. Robert raised an eyebrow. That's a bold accusation. What makes you so sure? Matthew sighed, picking up a pen. Gut instinct. The president's insistence on favoring Japan over China, even when China's offering millions of florins, doesn't make strategic sense unless there's a personal stake. Robert took a seat across from Matthew, his tone turning serious. You're thinking blackmail. Matthew nodded. It's possible, but I need proof. I want to start with Clay's past, his political career, his private life, anything that could be leveraged. Over the next few hours, Matthew and Robert delved into every piece of information they could find on President Theodore Clay. They pored over newspaper clippings, political biographies, and archived campaign records. The more they searched, the clearer it became that Clay had kept certain parts of his life deliberately vague. Look at this, Robert said, sliding a newspaper article across the desk. The headline read, Senator Clay's European Diplomacy Tour, a New Chapter for Amarathia. It's a puff piece, Matthew muttered, scanning the text. No specifics, just talk of strengthening ties with European allies. But why was he in Vienna for 2 days with no recorded meetings? Robert shrugged. Could have been personal time. Or it could have been something more, Matthew said, narrowing his eyes. Dig into his itinerary for that trip. I want to know who he met and where he stayed. By the next morning, Robert had unearthed more details about Clay's European tour. A small lead pointed them to Vienna, where Clay had reportedly attended an exclusive private event at the residence of an Austrian countess. The name Emilia von Hartmann appeared repeatedly in whispers and rumors about the event. Countess Emilia von Hartmann, Robert read aloud, flipping through a dossier, an aristocrat with a reputation for scandal. Known for her charm and associations with powerful men. Matthew leaned forward. Associations? Affairs, to put it bluntly, Robert replied, smirking. She's been linked to a handful of European dignitaries and even a few visiting Americans. It's all speculative, of course. Matthew tapped his pen against the desk. What about Clay? Any mention of him in connection to her? Robert paused before sliding a translated excerpt from a Vienna gossip column toward Matthew. This was published 2 weeks after Clay left Vienna. The passage described a mysterious American statesman rumored to have been charmed by Countess von Hartmann's wit and beauty. Though it didn't name Clay directly, the timeline aligned too perfectly to ignore. The breakthrough came when Robert uncovered correspondence from an Austrian archive. Among the letters was one addressed to H, signed with the initials TC. The handwriting was a match for Clay's known signatures. Matthew read the letter carefully. Its tone was intimate, discussing a brief but meaningful connection and expressing regret that circumstances forced their parting. Though it didn't explicitly mention an affair, the undertones were undeniable. This is the kind of thing that could ruin a man's career, Matthew said, holding the letter up to the light. Robert frowned. It's damaging, sure, but is it enough for blackmail? Matthew leaned back, considering, not on its own, there has to be more. Matthew tasked a small team of trusted aides with tracing Clay's campaign finances during the years following his European trip. The findings were damning. A substantial donation, over 50,000 florins, had been funneled into Clay's campaign fund shortly after his return from Europe. The source was untraceable, but the intermediary was a Swiss banking firm known for its discretion. Swiss banks. Matthew muttered, examining the records, the go-to for laundering sensitive transactions. And the timing's suspicious. Robert added, the donation came right after Clay announced his bid for higher office. It's like someone wanted to ensure his rise to power. Matthew tapped the documents on his desk. If this money came from someone connected to von Hartmann, it would explain everything. An affair with her, followed by a covert donation? That's enough leverage to make Clay dance to anyone's tune. Which means, yeah, Theodore is not really being honest with us. A day later, Matthew Hesch stormed through the halls of the White House, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with purpose. The guards, recognizing him as a regular visitor and a key figure in the Republic's military-industrial complex, hesitated only briefly before allowing him to pass. His reputation preceded him, but the determined fire in his eyes told them that today, he wasn't just another visitor. As he approached the reception room, a junior staffer stepped forward, raising a hand. In protest, Mr. Hesch, the president is in a meeting. Matthew brushed past him. I know exactly where he is. The doors to the Oval Office swung open with a firm push inside. President Theodore Clay sat at his desk, flanked by Ambassador Li Ming. Both men looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. Matthew, Clay began. This is highly inappropriate. I know it is inappropriate, Mr. President, Matthew said, his gaze flickering to the ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, we would be delighted to offer you the same level of support we have provided to Japan. Ambassador Li's expression brightened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. You mean to say? Yes, Matthew continued, glancing at President Clay. Hesch Industries will supply China with the advanced vehicles and weaponry you require. Training for your forces will also be included to ensure their effective use. Clay's face flushed with a mix of anger and helplessness. Matthew, this is not your decision to make. Well, I can now, Matthew replied. Chapter 123. Matthew Hesch walked out of the Oval Office's reception room and into the heart of the building. He wasn't there to play politics or respect protocols. He had come to the White House to get answers, and he wasn't leaving without them. President Theodore Clay sat stiffly in a chair near the fireplace, staring at the documents Matthew had just laid out. His normally composed demeanor was cracking, and his silence said more than any words could. Mr. President, Matthew began firmly, standing across from Clay. We both know these documents raise serious questions. I've pieced together enough to understand that your trip to Vienna wasn't just diplomacy. So let's skip the denials and get to the point. Clay's jaw tightened. He reached for a glass of water on the table beside him but didn't drink. You've done a lot of digging, Matthew, perhaps too much. I don't think you're in a position to make veiled threats, Matthew replied, his tone sharp. These documents point to something personal, something sensitive that the Japanese could easily exploit. The letter, the donation, your time in Vienna, it all adds up. Clay remained silent, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Matthew leaned forward. This isn't just about you, Theodore. It's about the Republic. You're compromising its credibility and security because of your personal mistakes. So, I'll ask you directly. Did the Japanese use this information to force your hand? The president looked up, his face pale. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke slowly. They didn't outright say it, but it was clear they had the upper hand. When they presented the dossier, it wasn't just about me. It was about the consequences for the entire country if my reputation were destroyed. So, they hinted at exposing this, Matthew clarified. And you decided it was better to comply than to risk the fallout. Clay exhaled heavily, his composure faltering. You don't understand the position I was in. If this had come out, it wouldn't just be me ruined. It would destabilize the administration, erode public trust, and invite chaos. I had to act. Matthew straightened, his voice cold. You didn't act for the Republic, Theodore. You acted for yourself. Don't try to spin this as some noble sacrifice. The president flinched but didn't respond. Matthew continued, his tone measured. You're the leader of this nation, and yet you've allowed foreign powers to dictate our policies. Your personal failures have put us in this position, and now we're scrambling to fix it. Clay shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly. What are you going to do with this information? Expose me? Bring down the administration? Matthew stared at him for a long moment. I'm not here to destroy you. That would only cause more problems, but this ends now. No more games, no more secrets. We need to restore balance, and we need to do it quickly. Clay nodded weakly. What do you suggest? Hesh Industries will supply China with the same weapons and vehicles we provided to Japan, Matthew said firmly. That's non-negotiable. If the Japanese complain, let them. It's the only way to prevent this conflict from spiraling further out of control. The president rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted. And if they retaliate? Matthew crossed his arms. Then we deal with it, but we cannot keep favoring one side. It's not sustainable. Clay hesitated before finally nodding. Fine, but you'll make the announcement. It can't come from me. Matthew smirked, a hint of sarcasm in his tone. Of course, wouldn't want to risk your image any further. The president didn't respond, his expression resigned. Matthew leaned over the desk, his voice low and serious. This is your last chance, Theodore. If I catch wind of anything else like this, I won't stop at confronting you. I'll take it to the people. Clay met his gaze, the weight of the threat sinking in. Understood. Matthew grabbed his briefcase and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced back. You've got one job now, Theodore. Keep the Republic intact. Don't make it harder than it already is. Without waiting for a response, Matthew walked out of the Oval Office, his steps measured and deliberate. He didn't feel victorious. The damage had already been done, and repairing it would be an uphill battle, but at least now he knew the truth and he wouldn't let it be used against the Republic any longer. Robert Anders was waiting for him near the entrance. His expression was tense, but he said nothing as Matthew approached. Well? Robert asked after a moment. He cracked. Matthew replied simply, the Japanese had leverage, just as we suspected. And now we level the playing field, prepare the contracts for China. Hesh Industries is going to arm them the same way we armed Japan. Robert nodded, though his face remained grim. And the president? Matthew paused before answering. He's on thin ice. One more misstep and he won't have a presidency left to salvage. As they walked toward the car, Robert glanced at Matthew. Do you think ITLL make a difference arming both sides? Matthew sighed, his expression unreadable. I don't know, Robert, but it's the only card we have left to play. The car pulled away from the White House, leaving behind a leader who had been brought to his knees by his own failings. For Matthew, the confrontation wasn't the end of the fight, it was just the beginning. The world was still on the brink of chaos, and the Republic's future was far from secure, but at least now he had taken a step toward balancing the scales. As the car navigated the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., Robert glanced out the window at the sprawling government buildings. Matthew, this move could put us in the crosshairs of both Japan and China if they suspect our involvement. Are you prepared for the fallout? Experience tales at Novelbin. Matthew stared ahead, his jaw clenched. We've been in the crosshairs since the first shipment left the docks. The difference now is that we're taking control of the narrative. Let them speculate, it won't change the fact that we're ensuring balance. Chapter 124. Matthew Hesh walked into the conference room at Hesh Industries ready for his meeting with Ambassador Li Ming. The room was plain, with a long table and several chairs reflecting the no-nonsense attitude Matthew had taken on in recent days. Robert Anders sat to his right, flipping through a stack of documents while a few other staff members prepared to take notes. When Ambassador Li entered, his face was a mix of concern and cautious optimism. He shook Matthew's hand firmly and took a seat. Enjoy exclusive content from Novelbin. Mr. Hesh, Li began. Thank you for meeting with me again. I trust the recent discussions have paved the way for progress? Matthew nodded. We're here to finalize the details, Ambassador. My company is ready to supply China with the equipment and training necessary to counter Japan's advances. Li's eyes lit up. That is excellent news. Your technology has already proven its effectiveness on the battlefield, as we've seen from reports of its use by the Japanese. Having it on our side will make a significant difference. Matthew motioned to Robert, who handed over a folder filled with contracts and specifications. Here's the breakdown of what we can provide: armored vehicles, precision rifles, mortars, and other advanced weaponry. Well, also send a team of engineers and trainers to ensure your forces can use and maintain the equipment. Li flipped through the documents, occasionally nodding. These terms are fair, he said, but I must ask, what changed? Previously, the Republic seemed reluctant to assist us directly. Matthew leaned back in his chair. The situation changed. The Republic recognizes the need for balance in East Asia. Arming one side while ignoring the other creates instability, and that's something we can't afford. This isn't about taking sides, it's about ensuring neither side gains too much of an advantage. We studied Matthew's expression carefully, as though searching for any hint of dishonesty, and President Clay supports this decision? Matthew's face remained neutral. The president is aware of the arrangement. My company operates independently, but we act in the interest of the Republic's long-term security. This is the right move for everyone involved. Li nodded, seemingly satisfied. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Hesh. China will remember your support during these difficult times. Matthew stood, extending his hand. Then let's move forward. We'll begin preparing the first shipment immediately. Expect the equipment to arrive within the month. Li shook his hand firmly. You have our gratitude, Mr. Hesh. This partnership will save lives. The meeting ended and the ambassador left with his aides. As soon as the door closed, Robert turned to Matthew, his expression serious. That went smoothly, Robert said, but this is going to put us in a tough spot. Japan won't be happy when they find out. Matthew crossed his arms, his tone firm. They don't have to be happy. Our goal is to maintain balance, not to please everyone. Let them complain, it won't change the fact that this is the only way forward. Robert nodded but still looked concerned. Do you think we're ready for the fallout if this escalates? Matthew glanced at the documents on the table, his jaw tightening. We've been dealing with fallout since this began. This is just another step in a larger game. We'll handle it. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity at Hesh Industries. Workers on the factory floor operated around the clock, assembling vehicles, testing weapons, and packaging everything for transport. The sound of machinery echoed through the massive facility, underscoring the urgency of the task. Matthew walked through the production lines with Henry Grayson, the head of manufacturing. Grayson pointed out the progress on the armored vehicles, which were lined up in neat rows, their angular designs reflecting Hesh Industries' cutting-edge technology. The M87s are almost ready to ship, Grayson said. We've installed additional plating on these models for extra durability. The rifles and mortars are being packed as we speak. Good, Matthew replied. The Chinese forces will need these as soon as possible. Make sure everything is triple-checked before it leaves. We can't afford any mistakes. Grayson hesitated for a moment before speaking. You know, this isn't just another order. This could change the course of the war. Matthew stopped walking and turned to face him. I'm aware, Henry, that's why we need to get it right. Grayson nodded and returned to overseeing the production lines. In the logistics office, Matthew met with his team to finalize the transport plan. The shipment would be sent to a secure port in southern China, where Chinese military officials would take custody. Hesh Industries would send a team of engineers and trainers to accompany the shipment and provide immediate support. Ambassador Li has assured us of full cooperation, Matthew said, addressing the team. But I want everything to be as discreet as possible. No unnecessary attention. One of the logistics managers raised a hand. What about security? There's always a risk of interception, especially with something this sensitive. Well, coordinate with the Chinese military for an escort, Matthew replied. But I also want backup plans in case anything goes wrong. Make sure we have contingencies in place. The team nodded. taking notes as Matthew continued outlining the plan. As the shipment neared completion, Matthew received word that the Chinese military had confirmed the arrival date at the port. He stood in the control room overlooking the factory floor, watching as the final crates were loaded onto transport trucks. Robert joined him, holding a clipboard. Everything's on schedule. The trucks will leave tonight and head for the docks. Good, Matthew said, his eyes still on the floor below. This is just the beginning, Robert. We're playing a dangerous game, but it's the only move we've got. Robert nodded, though his expression remained uneasy. Let's just hope it's enough. The day after the shipment left the factory, Matthew met with Ambassador Lee one last time to discuss the timeline for deployment. The equipment is on its way, Matthew said. Your forces should have it within the week. My team will arrive shortly after to begin training. Lee smiled, relief evident on his face. You've given us a fighting chance, Mr. Hesh. I cannot thank you enough. Matthew shook his head. Save your thanks for when this conflict is over. Chapter 125. The sun rose over the battle-scarred plains of northern China, casting long shadows across trenches, craters, and abandoned fortifications. 4 months. The Chinese forces had been on the defensive, battered and outmatched by the technological superiority of the Japanese. But today, the tide was shifting. At the command center in Liaodong, General Wei Zhang stood over a large map of the region, his hands clasped behind his back. Around him, officers hurriedly exchanged updates and issued orders. Over crackling radios, the situation was tense but hopeful. We've received reports from the northern sector, one officer announced. The Japanese forces have begun to fall back. Our armored units are advancing faster than anticipated. General Zhang's eyes flicked toward the officer, his face calm but determined. And the casualties? Minimal, sir, the officer replied. The new equipment is proving effective against their defenses. Zhang nodded, his gaze returning to the map. The deployment of Hesh Industries' advanced vehicles and weapons had changed everything. The M87 armored vehicles, with their reinforced plating and firepower, allowed Chinese forces to punch through Japanese lines with unprecedented efficiency. Precision rifles and portable mortars gave their infantry the edge they desperately needed in the northern front. A column of M87s moved steadily across open terrain, their angular designs cutting in. Imposing figure against the backdrop of smoke and fire. Inside one of the vehicles, Captain Lin Guang reviewed the mission briefing with his crew. Our objective is to secure the rail junction at Haicheng, Lin said, his voice steady. It's a key supply line for the Japanese. Once it's under our control, they'll be forced to retreat further south. The driver nodded, gripping the controls. Understood, Captain. As they approached the target, Japanese forces opened fire from fortified positions. Machine guns rattled, and artillery shells screamed overhead. The M87s pressed forward, their armor absorbing the brunt of the assault. Lin's vehicle halted briefly, its turret swiveling to lock onto an enemy bunker. Fire! Lin ordered. The cannon roared, sending a high-velocity shell straight into the bunker. The explosion sent debris flying, silencing the machine gun within behind the armored vehicles. Chinese infantry surged forward. Using the M87s as mobile cover, Lieutenant Zhang Wei led his squad through the chaos, his new Hesh rifle at the ready. Spotting a cluster of Japanese soldiers retreating toward a trench, he raised his weapon and fired. The rifle's precision and range were unmatched, cutting down targets with surgical accuracy. Keep moving, Zhang shouted to his men. We've got them on the run. By midday, the rail junction was under Chinese control. The Japanese forces, cut off from their supply lines, began a disorganized retreat. Smoke billowed from burning equipment, and the sounds of sporadic gunfire faded into the distance. Word of the victory at Haicheng spread quickly through the ranks, boosting morale and solidifying the belief that the Japanese were no longer invincible. Over the next few weeks, Chinese forces launched a series of coordinated counteroffensives, each one chipping away at the Japanese hold on the mainland. In the south, the city of Jianzhou became the site of a fierce battle. Japanese tanks, previously a symbol of their dominance, found themselves outmatched by the M87s. The Chinese vehicles, equipped with superior targeting systems and armor, dominated the urban battlefield. Major Qin Liang, commanding the Jianzhou operation, watched from a rooftop as his forces advanced through the city. Explosions rocked the streets below, and the crack of Rifle fire echoed off the building's report. Chen said into his radio, "Sector 3 is secure," came the reply, "The Japanese are retreating toward the river." Chen allowed himself a rare smile. "Good, pursue them, but maintain caution. They'll try to regroup on the other side." Meanwhile, in the air, Chinese reconnaissance planes equipped with advanced targeting systems provided real-time intelligence. This allowed ground forces to anticipate Japanese movements and strike with precision. The Japanese, unable to match the speed and coordination of the Chinese counteroffensives, found themselves increasingly outmaneuvered. By early November, Japanese forces were concentrated in a shrinking pocket near the coast. General Zhang stood in his command tent, studying the latest reports. The plan for the final push was risky but necessary. "Well, encircle their remaining forces here," Zhang said, pointing to a position on the map. "Our armored units will lead the charge, supported by infantry and artillery. We cannot allow them to regroup or escape." The operation began at dawn. The M87s moved in a wide arc, cutting off escape routes and trapping the Japanese between the advancing Chinese forces and the coastline. Artillery shells rained down on enemy positions, forcing them to abandon fortified defenses on the ground. Captain Lin's unit spearheaded the assault. His vehicle plowed through enemy barricades, its cannon methodically destroying targets. Behind him, waves of infantry advanced, their rifles and mortars laying down, suppressing fire. The Japanese fought fiercely, but their morale was crumbling. The realization that they were outmatched technologically and strategically sapped their will to fight. By the time the Chinese reached the final stronghold, many Japanese soldiers were surrendering rather than facing certain defeat. As the sun set over the battlefield, the Chinese flag was raised over the Japanese command post. General Zhang arrived to survey the scene, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The mainland was secure, and the Japanese had been forced to retreat entirely to their ships. Ambassador Li Ming, who had been monitoring the situation from a nearby city, sent an urgent message to Matthew Hesh. "Mr. Hesh," the message read, "your support has turned the tide of this war. The Chinese people owe you a debt of gratitude. This victory would not have been possible without the advanced technology your company provided." Back at Hesh Industries, Matthew read the message in his office. Robert stood nearby, watching him closely. "Experience tales at Novelbin. Looks like the Chinese are satisfied with the weapons," Matthew said. "They effectively use the new technology and adapt quicker than we have anticipated." "That's true, but I wonder how the Japanese would react when they found out about that," Robert commented. "That's the president problem, not ours," Matthew replied. Chapter 126. The sun was just beginning to rise over Washington, D.C., casting a soft orange glow over the White House. Inside the Oval Office, President Theodore Clay sat at his desk, reviewing reports on the ongoing war in East Asia. The Chinese counteroffensive had been a success, and the Japanese retreat was now making headlines worldwide. Clay barely had time to sip his coffee before his chief of staff, William Gardner, burst into the room. His face was tense, and his voice carried urgency. "Mr. President, the Japanese ambassador is here. He's demanding an immediate audience," Gardner said. Clay raised an eyebrow. "Let him in. I've been expecting this." Moments later, Ambassador Takahiro Nakamura entered the Oval Office, his usual calm demeanor replaced with barely contained frustration. He bowed briefly but skipped any pleasantries. "Mr. President," Nakamura began, his tone sharp, "I demand an explanation. Your country has betrayed us." Clay leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. "Ambassador, you'll have to be more specific. How exactly have we betrayed you?" Nakamura stepped forward, his face reddening. "Your arms manufacturer, Hesh Industries, has been supplying advanced weapons to China. The same technology we purchased to secure victory is now being used against us. Because of this, we've been forced to retreat from the mainland. This is unacceptable." Clay smirked slightly, placing his hands on the desk. "Ambassador, Hesh Industries operates independently. The government doesn't dictate their business decisions." Nakamura slammed his fist on the desk, his composure slipping. "Don't play games with me, Mr. President. You authorized those sales to China, just as you did for us. This is a clear breach of the understanding between our nations." Clay's expression darkened. He stood, his towering presence adding weight to his words. "Let me make something very clear. Ambassador, you seem to think you have leverage here, but you do not." Nakamura's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't be so sure, Mr. President. You know what we hold over you. If the details of your scandal were to become public, your administration would collapse. The world would see you for the hypocrite you are." Clay chuckled coldly, his gaze icy. "And you think anyone in this country would believe you? A foreign diplomat from Japan accusing the president of Amarathia? Let me enlighten you, Nakamura. This is Amarathia. Your word against mine doesn't stand a chance here." Nakamura was momentarily stunned by the president's bluntness. Are you saying you'd dismiss the truth so easily? Even if we presented evidence? Clay leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. Even if you had all the evidence in the world, the people of this country would never side with you over me. Your people are viewed as outsiders, inferior in their eyes. Your accusations would be laughed off as desperate propaganda. You have no power here. The ambassador's face flushed with a mix of confusion and anger. Then why, Mr. President? Why did you allow yourself to be blackmailed in the first place if you had no intention of honoring the agreement? Clay smiled coldly, clasping his hands behind his back. Because it was profitable, Nakamura, your country's desperation to buy Hesh Industries technology brought in enormous revenue through taxes on those sales, and now, thanks to China buying the same weapons, we're earning even more. Every shipment you ordered, every deal you signed, filled our coffers. This war is an economic boon for Amarathia. Nakamura's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at Clay, realization dawning on him. This whole time, Clay continued, you thought you were in control, but you were just another customer paying a premium for our products. The Chinese are doing the same, do you see now? Amarathia benefits no matter who wins. The war funds our growth while leaving you and the Chinese to bleed each other dry. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Nakamura finally spoke, his voice quieter but still laced with anger. You played us both. You used this war for your own gain. Clay shrugged. Welcome to diplomacy, Ambassador. Now, unless you have something new to say, I suggest you leave my office. Nakamura straightened his posture, his expression a mask of barely concealed fury. This isn't over. Mr. President, Japan will not forget this betrayal. Clay stepped forward, his tone dismissive. You're right. It's not over. But your threats are meaningless here. Now, get out of my office. The ambassador hesitated for a moment, then turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. Gardner, standing near the door, exchanged a brief glance with Clay before following Nakamura to ensure he left the premises. Once the room was empty, Clay sat back down, a smug grin creeping across his face. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. Discover more stories at novelbin.com. Checkmate. He muttered under his breath as President Clay leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee with a self-satisfied smirk. The door creaked open slightly. William Gardner poked his head in, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Mr. President, do you think it's wise to antagonize the Japanese like that? Gardner asked cautiously. Clay set his coffee down, fixing Gardner with a sharp gaze. Wise or not, it was necessary. The Japanese needed to understand that they were never in control here. If they want to keep playing in the big leagues, they'll have to learn that Amarathia sets the rules. Gardner entered fully, closing the door behind him. But if they retaliate economically or diplomatically, they want, Clay interrupted, his tone firm. They're too dependent on us for technology and trade. Their military is already stretched thin from this war. They might bluster and threaten, but they can't afford to burn the only bridge keeping them afloat. Gardner nodded, though the unease on his face didn't fade. And what about Hesh Industries? Matthew Hesh won't stay quiet forever. If he finds out the full scope of your dealings, Clay's expression hardened. Hesh won't be a problem. He's too focused on maintaining his own empire. As long as he's making money, he'll keep playing the game. Gardner hesitated but eventually nodded. Understood, sir. Clay waved him off. Good. Chapter 127. The war in East Asia dragged on into the first year, with no end in sight. The Chinese counteroffensive had pushed the Japanese forces off the mainland, but skirmishes continued along the coastal waters and in contested islands. Both nations were heavily dependent on supplies from the Great Republic of Amarathia to sustain their war efforts, and Hesh Industries stood at the center of the conflict. In the sprawling Hesh Industries headquarters in Sylvania, Matthew Hesh reviewed the latest quarterly financial report in his office. The numbers were staggering. Revenue from weapon sales to Japan and China had doubled in the past year, and a new buyer had entered the picture. Korea. Matthew? Robert Anders said as he entered the office with another stack of papers. You're going to want to see this. Matthew looked up from the report. What is it, Robert? Robert placed the documents on the desk. It's the contract from the Korean delegation. They've placed an initial order for rifles, mortars, and light armored vehicles. They're preparing for the possibility of getting dragged into the conflict. Matthew nodded, flipping through the pages. Smart move on their part. If this war spills into the Korean peninsula, they'll need to be ready. And if it doesn't, they'll still have a modernized arsenal. Robert smirked. And we'll have another client in the region. Everyone wins. Except the people fighting the war, Matthew said, his tone grim. This isn't just business, Robert. It's a blood-soaked balancing act. Every weapon we sell keeps the conflict alive. Enjoy new adventures at Novelbin. Calm Robert hesitated. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Selling to both sides and now to Korea. Matthew leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Right or wrong doesn't matter in this business. What matters is maintaining balance. If one side gains too much power, the entire region collapses. We're keeping that from happening. Robert sighed but nodded. I'll finalize the Korean contract. Good, Matthew said. And make sure the delivery is discreet. We don't need anyone knowing how far our reach extends. In Seoul, the Korean government was abuzz with activity. Ministers and military leaders debated the best way to prepare for the potential spread of the war. Ambassador Han Min-jae, who had negotiated the deal with Hesh Industries, returned from Amarathia with news of the shipment. Our first delivery will arrive within the month, Han reported to the cabinet. Modern rifles, mortars, and light armored vehicles. This will put us on par with the Chinese and Japanese militaries. The Minister of Defense nodded. It's a significant investment, but it's necessary. We can't afford to be caught unprepared. Across the peninsula, Korean factories ramped up production to support the integration of the new equipment. Hesh engineers and trainers, flown in under the guise of civilian consultants, worked closely with the Korean military to ensure a smooth transition. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the war had devolved into a brutal stalemate. The Chinese Navy, bolstered by coastal defenses and advanced targeting systems, repelled repeated Japanese attempts to retake key ports. Japanese submarines armed with Hesh torpedoes harassed Chinese shipping lanes, disrupting supply chains. In the skies, reconnaissance planes and bombers from both nations clashed in deadly dogfights. Hesh Industries had supplied advanced targeting systems to both sides, making every engagement a high-tech game of cat and mouse. On the ground, the situation was equally grim. In northern China, Chinese forces used Hesh armored vehicles to launch a devastating assault on Japanese supply depots. In retaliation, Japanese artillery, equipped with precision-guided munitions, leveled entire villages suspected of harboring Chinese troops. Back at Hesh Industries, the factory floors operated around the clock. Workers assembled rifles, mortars, and vehicles at an unprecedented pace. The clanging of metal and the hum of machinery echoed through the massive facility, a testament to the company's role as the lifeblood of the war economy. In a high-level meeting, Matthew and his top executives discussed the future. Our production capacity is maxed out, said Henry Grayson, head of manufacturing. We're meeting current demand, but if the Koreans place another large order, we'll need to expand. Matthew nodded. Then expand, acquire more facilities if necessary. We can't afford delays. And what about logistics? Asked Sarah Klein, head of operations. We've already had issues with transporting shipments discreetly. If the wrong parties find out, then we deal with it. Matthew interrupted. Use decoy shipments, staggered routes, whatever it takes. Our clients expect results, not excuses. In Washington, President Clay watched the developments closely. His administration's decision to allow Hesh Industries to supply all sides of the conflict had drawn quiet criticism from some corners, but the economic benefits were undeniable. The war had boosted Amarathia's economy, creating jobs and filling government coffers with tax revenue. Gardner entered the Oval Office with a report. Mr. President, the latest figures are in. Tax revenue from Hesh Industries has surpassed projections. Clay smirked. As I said, Gardner, this war is the best thing that's happened to us. Let the rest of the world tear itself apart. We'll be stronger for it. But what happens when the war ends? Gardner asked. When the dust settles, won't they turn their attention to us? Clay waved him off. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, we keep playing the game. As the war dragged on, the human toll became impossible to ignore. Villages were razed, cities reduced to rubble, and countless lives lost. Refugees flooded into neighboring regions, their stories painting a grim picture of the conflict's devastation. In his private moments, even Matthew couldn't ignore the cost. Sitting in his office late one night, he stared at a photograph of his factory workers, their faces proud but weary. How much longer can we keep this up? He muttered to himself. Robert entered, holding a fresh batch of reports. The Korean shipment arrived safely, he said. They're already integrating the equipment. Matthew nodded but didn't look up. Good. Let's hope they don't need to use it. For now, the war showed no signs of ending, and as long as it continued, Hesh Industries would remain at the center of it all, profiting from a conflict that seemed destined to consume the region. Chapter 128. The war in East Asia had dragged on longer than anyone had anticipated. The once dynamic front lines had become entrenched, with both the Chinese and Japanese forces finding themselves unable to gain a decisive upper hand. The cost of the conflict, both in lives and resources, was becoming unbearable. Entire regions lay in ruins, economies teetered on collapse, and public outcry against the war reached a boiling point in both nations. In the corridors of power, whispers of a ceasefire began to grow louder. Neither China nor Japan could afford to continue the war, and both sides knew they needed an intermediary to facilitate negotiations. Their eyes turned to the Great Republic of Amarathia, the one nation with the leverage and influence to bring them to the table. In Washington, D.C., President Theodore Clay was in the Oval Office when the official requests arrived. Both the Chinese and Japanese ambassadors had submitted formal appeals for Amarathia to mediate peace talks. William Gardner, the president's chief of staff, placed the documents on Clay's desk. "Mr. President," Gardner began, "both sides are asking us to mediate. They've reached their limit." Clay leaned back in his chair, a small smirk forming on his face. "Of course they have. They've bled each other dry, and now they want us to clean up the mess." Gardner hesitated. "Do you think it's wise to get involved? We've profited from this war by staying neutral. Mediation could expose us to criticism, especially if it looks like we're favoring one side." Clay's smirk widened. "William, we've already been involved. This war has lined our pockets and strengthened our position on the world stage. Mediation is the next logical step. It solidifies our role as the dominant power." Experience tales at Novelbin. Gardner nodded reluctantly. "The question is, how do we approach this without jeopardizing our relationships with either side?" "We don't take sides," Clay said firmly. "We play the role of the impartial broker while ensuring that whatever deal is struck benefits us the most." The ceasefire talks were scheduled to take place at an opulent Amarathian estate in Geneva, a location chosen for its neutrality and security. The estate was heavily guarded, with soldiers and intelligence agents ensuring no disruptions. Media access was tightly controlled, with only a select few journalists allowed near the venue. On the day of the talks, delegations from China and Japan arrived under heavy security. The Chinese delegation was led by General Wei Zhang, whose tactical acumen had turned the tide for China on the battlefield. The Japanese delegation was headed by Ambassador Takahiro Nakamura, whose reputation as a skilled negotiator made him the ideal choice for such high-stakes discussions. Matthew Hesh was also in attendance, though his presence was not publicly announced. As the head of Hesh Industries, his role in supplying both sides of the conflict made him an indispensable figure behind the scenes. He sat quietly in the background, observing the proceedings. With a keen eye, President Clay opened the talks with a speech emphasizing the importance of peace and stability in East Asia. "Gentlemen," he began, standing at the head of the long table, "the world has watched as your nations have fought valiantly, but now the time has come to turn swords into plowshares. As the mediator, the Great Republic of Amarathia is here to ensure that these negotiations lead to a fair and lasting resolution." General Wei Zhang spoke first, his tone measured but firm. "China seeks a restoration of its sovereignty over the territories invaded by Japan. We demand reparations for the destruction caused by their aggression." Ambassador Nakamura responded coolly. "Japan seeks assurances that its security and interests in the region will be respected. We are prepared to discuss reparations, but only within reasonable limits." The tension in the room was palpable. Clay allowed the two sides to air their grievances before stepping in. "Both of your nations have legitimate concerns," he said. "But if we are to make progress, we must focus on common ground. Let's begin with a framework for the ceasefire." Over the next several days, the delegations debated fiercely. Issues ranged from territorial disputes to the demilitarization of contested zones. Clay and his team worked tirelessly to keep the talks on track, often mediating heated exchanges between Zhang and Nakamura. Matthew Hesh played a more subtle role. During breaks in the official sessions, he met privately with members of both delegations, offering insights into how Amarathian technology could support post-war reconstruction. His proposals included joint ventures in infrastructure development, a move designed to keep Hesh Industries profitable in peacetime. By the fourth day, progress began to show. Both sides agreed to a temporary ceasefire and the establishment of a neutral zone monitored by Amarathian observers. Talks then shifted to reparations and economic cooperation. "China's infrastructure has been devastated," Zhang argued. Reparations are not just a demand. They are a necessity. Japan cannot be expected to shoulder the entire burden, Nakamura countered. We are willing to contribute, but it must be proportional. Clay interjected. Reparations should not be seen as a punishment, but as an investment in regional stability. Both nations will benefit from a stable, prosperous East Asia. Let's structure this as a collaborative fund, with contributions from both sides. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations, an agreement was finally reached. The Treaty of Geneva included the following key points: a ceasefire and withdrawal of troops from contested territories, the establishment of a neutral zone, monitored by Amorathian peacekeepers, a joint reparations and reconstruction fund, with contributions from both nations, a commitment to future diplomatic dialogue to resolve disputes peacefully. The treaty was signed in a formal ceremony, with President Clay standing between General Zhang and Ambassador Nakamura as they affixed their signatures. This treaty marks a new chapter for East Asia, Clay declared to the gathered media. It is a testament to what can be achieved when nations choose dialogue over conflict. Back in Washington, Clay reveled in the success of the negotiations. The treaty solidified Amorathia's position as the world's preeminent power. Both militarily and diplomatically, Hesh Industries, too, stood to gain as reconstruction efforts in China and Japan required advanced technology and equipment in Sylvania. Matthew Hesh reflected on the events of the past months. The war had brought immense profits but also profound questions about the ethics of his work. As he reviewed the latest orders for reconstruction equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next conflict was already brewing. For now, peace had been achieved. But in the shadows, the forces that had driven the war continued to simmer, waiting for their next opportunity. And for the great Republic of Amorathia, the game of power and profit showed no signs of ending. Chapter 129. The ink on the Treaty of Geneva had barely dried, but the ramifications of the agreement were already rippling through East Asia and beyond. The ceasefire brought an uneasy calm to the region, but the scars of war remained visible in the devastated cities and displaced populations, in the power centers of Washington, Sylvania, Beijing, and Tokyo. The focus shifted from battlefields to boardrooms and rebuilding efforts. In Beijing, General Wei Zhang returned to a hero's welcome. The Chinese government wasted no time leveraging the Treaty of Geneva as a victory for their resilience. Propaganda posters depicted a triumphant China rising from the ashes, its soldiers standing proud beside the M87 armored vehicles that had become a symbol of their resurgence. However, behind the scenes, the challenges were immense. Roads, bridges, and railways lay in ruins, and entire provinces faced food shortages. The Reconstruction Fund established by the treaty offered hope, but it was far from enough. As promised during the negotiations, Hesh Industries quickly stepped in, offering advanced construction equipment, modular housing units, and energy solutions. Matthew Hesh had sent a delegation of engineers and business executives to oversee the deployment of resources. In a private meeting with Chinese officials, he pitched a bold plan. Rebuilding your nation isn't just about restoring what was lost, Matthew said, addressing a group of ministers. It's an opportunity to modernize. Hesh Industries can provide state-of-the-art technology to help China leap ahead economically and militarily. The officials exchanged glances, wary but intrigued. China's dependence on foreign corporations for reconstruction was a bitter pill to swallow, but they couldn't ignore the benefits. In Tokyo, the mood was more somber. Ambassador Nakamura's return was met with subdued acknowledgement rather than celebration. While the treaty prevented further losses, it was viewed as a concession rather than a victory. The Japanese government faced mounting pressure from its citizens to account for the heavy toll of the war. Prime Minister Takahashi convened an emergency cabinet meeting to address the nation's path forward. The discussions centered on how to rebuild Japan's economy while maintaining its military capabilities. We must use this period of peace to regroup and fortify, Takahashi declared. Our military may have retreated, but our spirit has not. We will rise stronger. Like China, Japan turned to Hesh Industries for assistance. Matthew's team had anticipated this, offering reconstruction packages tailored to Japan's needs. In a private meeting with Japanese officials, he presented a new line of technology designed to modernize their industries. This isn't just about rebuilding, Matthew told them. It's about regaining your edge. With our support, Japan can position itself as the most advanced economy in East Asia. The officials were hesitant but ultimately agreed. Hesh Industries' influence continued to grow as it became indispensable to both sides. In Washington, President Theodore Clay was enjoying the fruits of his administration's calculated moves. The war had cemented Amarathia's position as a global power broker, and the Treaty of Geneva was hailed as a diplomatic triumph. However, Clay was not one to rest on his laurels. In a private meeting with his cabinet, Clay outlined his vision for the post-war world. Gentlemen, he began, we've not only brokered peace but secured our dominance. The reconstruction of East Asia is a goldmine, and Amarathia is at the center of it. But this is just the beginning. We must ensure that our influence continues to grow. Gardner, his chief of staff, spoke up. Mr. President, there's already criticism from certain sectors. They're accusing us of profiteering from the war. Clay smirked. Let them talk. The economy is booming, unemployment is down, and our international standing has never been higher. As long as the people see results, they won't care how we achieve them. Explore new worlds at Novelbin. Meanwhile, in Sylvania, Hesh Industries was operating at full capacity. The factory floors that had once churned out weapons were now producing equipment for reconstruction and modernization. Matthew oversaw every detail, ensuring that his company remained indispensable to both China and Japan. Robert Anders, Matthew's trusted advisor, approached him with a report. Matthew, the numbers are staggering, Robert said, handing over a document. Our revenue from reconstruction contracts has already surpassed what we made during the war. Matthew scanned the report, his expression unreadable. Good. But this isn't just about money. Robert, we're shaping the future of East Asia. The question is, whose future will it be? Robert hesitated. Do you think the peace will last? Matthew leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. Peace is just a pause between conflicts. The seeds of the next war are already being sown. Our job is to be ready when it happens. While the Treaty of Geneva brought a temporary halt to hostilities, tensions between China and Japan remained high. Skirmishes occasionally broke out in contested territories, and both nations continued to build their militaries under the guise of reconstruction. In Korea, the government watched the developments with unease. The Korean peninsula had remained neutral during the war, but its strategic location made it a potential flashpoint for future conflicts. Ambassador Han Min-jae, who had negotiated Korea's initial arms deal with Hesh Industries, advocated for continued military modernization. We cannot rely on peace treaties to protect us, Han argued in a cabinet meeting. If another conflict erupts, Korea must be prepared. Matthew, ever the opportunist, reached out to Korea with an offer of expanded support. The Koreans, eager to ensure their security, accepted. Hesh Industries began shipping more advanced weaponry and technology to the peninsula, further solidifying its influence in the region. Late one night, Matthew sat alone in his office reviewing a map of East Asia. Markers indicated key reconstruction projects, military installations, and trade routes. The region was a patchwork of alliances and rivalries, all of which revolved around Amarathia's influence. Robert entered the room carrying a cup of coffee, burning the midnight oil again. Matthew nodded. This isn't just about East Asia, Robert, it's about the world. The balance of power is shifting, and we're at the center of it. Robert hesitated before asking, do you ever think about the cost of all this? The lives lost, the destruction? Matthew sighed, his gaze never leaving the map. Every decision has a cost, but if we don't shape the future, someone else will, and I'd rather it be us. As the weeks passed, the focus shifted from reconstruction to long-term planning. Matthew met with his top executives to discuss the company's strategy. We've secured our position in East Asia, Matthew began. Now, we need to look beyond Europe, Africa, South America. There are opportunities everywhere. The lessons we've learned here can be applied globally. Henry Grayson, the head of manufacturing, spoke up. Do you think we'll face resistance? Not every nation will welcome our involvement. Matthew smirked. Resistance is inevitable, but as long as we remain indispensable, they'll have no choice but to work with us. Chapter 130. Matthew Hesh sat in his office at Hesh Industries, skimming through the latest production reports. The steady hum of the factory could be heard faintly in the background, a reminder of the relentless work being done to fulfill contracts for reconstruction in East Asia. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, when Robert Anders entered the room. Matthew, you've got visitors, Robert said. Matthew raised an eyebrow. Who? Charles and Amber Fitzwilliam, Robert replied. They're waiting in the conference room. Matthew set the report aside and stood up. Let's not keep them waiting. Matthew entered the conference room to find Charles Fitzwilliam already seated, grinning as he flipped through a folder of documents. Amber stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling industrial complex. She turned when Matthew walked in. A faint smile on her face. Matthew, Charles said, standing to shake his hand. Good to see you. I wanted to drop by and personally congratulate you on the profits we've made this year. Matthew shook his hand and nodded at Amber. Charles, Amber, I wasn't expecting you. Charles laughed. Well, you've made me a lot of money. It felt only right to stop by and say thanks in person. Amber stepped forward, her tone softer. Hello, Matthew, it's been a while. Matthew nodded. It has. Good to see you both. Charles wasted no time diving into the numbers. He spread out reports on the table, pointing to key figures. Look at this, Matthew. Revenue from the war and reconstruction contracts has exceeded all projections. I've been in business a long time, but I've never seen numbers like these. Matthew studied the figures, his face calm. It's been a busy year. Busy? That's an understatement, Charles said with a chuckle. You've turned conflict into profit in a way most people can only dream of. You should be proud. Matthew nodded but didn't say much. He glanced at Amber, who was watching the exchange with a distant expression. Charles continued, I know you're already stretched thin, but I wanted to talk about expanding further. With the money coming in, there are opportunities we can't afford to miss. Matthew nodded slowly. We can discuss it further, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. While Charles continued to revel in the financial success, Amber finally spoke up. Matthew, can we talk for a moment? Alone. Charles raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. I'll head downstairs and check out the factory floor. You two catch up. He left the room, leaving Matthew and Amber alone. Amber turned to Matthew, her tone shifting. Matthew, I've been worried about you. You've been so focused on work that it feels like you've disappeared from everything else. Matthew frowned. I've been busy, Amber. You know how much is at stake. Amber stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. I know, but you can't keep doing this to yourself. You've built something incredible, but at what cost? You've barely taken a moment for yourself, let alone anyone else. Matthew sighed, leaning against the table. You're right, I've let work take over everything. Amber softened. I understand why you're doing it, but I miss the time we used to spend together. You're always here, buried in reports and contracts. I miss the Matthew who wasn't consumed by all of this. Matthew looked at Amber, her words hitting harder than he expected. He realized how much had neglected her and himself. You're right, Amber, I've been too focused on work and I've let everything else fall away. Amber's expression softened further. I'm not asking for much, Matthew, just one evening where we can be together. No work, no distractions, just us. But don't you have a man arranged for you by your father? I don't think she is going to appreciate you spending time alone with me, Matthew said. Oh, don't worry about it. If money and status is the basis for my father, then you already exceed the man that he had arranged for me. Plus, I don't like the man that he chose for me, rather I like. Amber paused, her cheeks reddening. Matthew tilted his head, his gaze fixed on Amber, waiting for her to finish her sentence. The silence hung in the air, her hesitation speaking louder than her words. You like? What, Amber? Matthew asked. Amber avoided his eyes for a moment, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It's nothing, she said quickly. I just meant I'd rather spend time with someone I actually enjoy being around. Matthew nodded, though her incomplete statement lingered in his mind. Well, if your father's approval isn't an issue, then I'll make sure we spend that evening together. Just tell me when. Discover exclusive content at Novelbin. Calm. Amber's lips curled into a small smile, relief evident in her eyes. How about this weekend? They'll leave the planning to you. Consider it done, Matthew said, his confidence returning. Well, have an evening worth remembering. Amber's smile widened. Thank you, Matthew, it means a lot. Before the moment could stretch further, the door swung open and Charles Fitzwilliam walked back in, his grin as broad as ever. The factory floor is impressive as always. Matthew, you've got quite the operation running here. Matthew straightened, his professional demeanor returning. We aim for efficiency, Charles. Well, you've nailed it, Charles said, taking his seat again. Now, back to business. Have you given any thought to diversifying? I've been hearing rumblings about opportunities in the South, infrastructure, transportation, energy, you name it. Well, I think there is one issue. You know, our factories are situated in the eastern side of the country. I was wondering if somehow we could make a channel like Suez Canal through Panama. Charles leaned back in his chair, considering Matthew's suggestion. The Panama Canal, you say? That's an ambitious idea. It would open up trade routes and drastically cut shipping times between the coasts. Matthew nodded eagerly. Exactly. With the kind of profits we're pulling in, it's a project worth looking into. Amarathia could spearhead the construction and Hesh Industries could be at the forefront of supplying the machinery and expertise. Very well, let's explore the idea.